My name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, Shorts. There's no co-host on these Shorts episodes. We have extended the time on these shorter episodes from 5 to 6 minutes to 15 to 20 minutes for this season. This is so that these shorts can serve as introductory episodes released ahead of our weekly, longer form episodes. But don't worry, I will still let you know my observations, ideas, thoughts, or rants about the literature, philosophy, psychology, and even the theology of leadership, particularly as we prepare for the restoration of leadership and leadership principles during the next historical high in America. Why these episodes? Well, because listening to me talk about leadership for now around 15 to 20 minutes is still better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. Even that business book that you bought with that famous person's name as the author, but you haven't applied any of the principles from that book to your leadership practices. At least not yet. What do we mean when we talk about restoration? We typically think of restoration as a way of returning a creation, a people, or even returning a community back into right relationship with itself and with a transcendent God. In our time, in the West, denatured from the mystical and spiritual world that used to drive us, we now primarily associate restoration with the repair of antique furniture, or, at scale, the gentrification of a neighborhood. But people in the West used to understand quite deeply that when events, ideas, and communities would quote-unquote go off the rails, restoring what had been lost would be a project in and of itself, requiring focus, discipline, and a fair bit of pugnacious masculine directness. This, quote from the book of Nehemiah, written in the BC era during the time of the rebuilding or restoration of the temple in Israel, illustrates an idea that is about to waken from its long slumber deep in the basement of the conscience of Western man. And I quote, "And it came to pass when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one unto his work. And it came to pass that from that time forth, that half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears, the shields, and the bows, and the habergeons. And the rulers were behind all the house of Judah. They which builded on the wall, and they that bare burdens, with those that laid it, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me, and I said unto the nobles, and to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large, and we are separated upon the wall, one far from another. In what place, therefore, ye hear the sound of the trumpet, resort ye thither unto us. Our God shall fight for us." Nehemiah 5:15 through 20, KJV. Yes, God will fight for us if we are faithful, and we have to rebuild with a shovel in one hand, weapon in the other. And thus we get to the author of our book this week, a man who pursued his goal to, quote, uncover truth, to serve his country, and to serve his church as ruthlessly as any postmodern man might, and did so in a manner most postmodern secular people would recognize innately. But even though he pursued goals that ultimately proved irrelevant to the ultimate flow of the stream of Western history, his methods of pursuing those goals are worth addressing for anybody interested in restoring what the West has lost since this author's time. Francis Bacon, the author of many essays on scientific empiricism and rationality, the first Viscount of St. Alban, was born on January 22nd, 1561, and he died April 9th, 1626. He is described by history and Wikipedia as an English philosopher and statesman who served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under King James I. Now, Francis Bacon had a wide-ranging education, mostly trained and educated by the Puritans in his time, and came up during a time of a lot of strife in England, and we'll revisit some of that strife in a moment. Bacon, in his professional life, argued for the importance of natural philosophy, guided by the scientific method, and his works remained influential throughout most of the scientific revolution up until about the middle of the 18th century. Bacon's claim to fame was that he believed that science could be achieved, and not necessarily discovery, but the act of science itself could be achieved by the use of a skeptical and methodological approach, whereby scientists aim to avoid misleading themselves. They aim to avoid being fooled again. Bacon was a patron of libraries, and he developed a system for cataloging books into three main categories: history, poetry, and philosophy, which could be further divided into specific subjects and subheadings. About some books, and this is how we know he would be a fan of the podcast, about some books he wrote, quote, "Some books are to be tasted, others swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested," close quote. Bacon stated early in his life, and he pretty much pursued this throughout the remainder of his life, that he had three goals: to uncover truth, to serve his country, and to serve his church. He pursued these goals ruthlessly through involvement with Parliament, particularly political involvement with Parliament, and through getting involved in various court intrigues in the English court, situated between the rules of Queen Elizabeth I, she of Spanish Armada fame, and King James I, he of the King James Bible fame. Now, this was a tumultuous time in English history where the Scots, the Irish, and the English were all battling on that island, after the awesome things and the ways in which the papacy had dealt with the English in their desire to follow on Luther and to be cast away from the papacy due to Henry VIII's mendacious behavior around his marriages a couple of generations earlier. Francis Bacon came up during a dynamic time, and the Great Instauration, which we will be covering on the main podcast episode this week, is an example of the kind of thinking that Bacon was allowed to engage in during a revolutionary and openly skeptical time in English history. Ironic detachment, a lack of sincerity, public mocking rather than modeling forgiveness, reacting to the first report, which is usually wrong, thinking we're better than the algorithm clearly tells us we are, gaps between external behavior and our internal desires, consuming rather than creating, criticizing from the cheap seats, resentment, bitterness, envy, lust, jealousy, anger, hatred, and of course, desiring strongly individual rewards, yet longing deeply for corporate punishments. All these things I've listed and more are the spiritual fruits of the post-Enlightenment psychological, intellectual, and spiritual movement away from believing in a transcendent God that rules over the material and the supernatural, and moving toward the apotheosis of, quote, man is the measure of all things. Bacon opposed this movement, but he saw the movement coming, and he sought to co-opt it. Idol worship that Bacon could not have imagined has sharpened now, in our time, in the early 21st century, to a point so deadly that its slow penetration of the collective psyche of the West is close to killing almost the entire Western project. By the way, an entire Western project based on the Enlightenment assumptions of free speech, free inquiry, and free thought. The idea that human reason, or as Bacon would call it, empiricism, can actually allow us to know something about the universe. And yet, like in all great myths, pagan and otherwise, when the backs of the heroes are against the wall, a person or persons emerges from the verge to make the hard decisions without much empathy for those who would rather not take the medicine prescribed and would rather kick the can of decline further down the road. Or, alternatively, would rather conduct their own reckoning. Here, in our time, in 2026, at the transition from the historical chaos of the Fourth Turning in the West that officially began with the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, and began inevitably to close with the alleged quote-unquote insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in January 2021, it is now time for leaders to lay aside the idols of chaos that Bacon would recognize and begin to lay the spiritual foundations of the next historical high. Dare I say, the next golden age of the West. But at a practical level, right? What is to be done? Well, I think a return to the things that Bacon would recognize and criticize in his own imitable way. Individual narratives wrapped in familial stories and traditions that scale to myths that lead to the creation of larger traditions that lead upward to the heights where that transcended God we tried, post-Nietzsche, foolishly, to replace with the yawning maw of our own human appetite, actually has been living the whole time, waiting for us to get our act together and come join him. These acts, of course, begin in homes, in families, and in communities. They wind through small businesses, civic enterprises, and eventually end up in corporations and nation-states. If this sounds like a long path and a long project, one that will outlast even my collapsing lifetime, that's because it is. For us as a people to live perhaps 80 years, and maybe 10 more on top of that, if we are so blessed by God. So, instead of lamenting the length of the project, or the hard work that will be required in order to pull it off, let's put our spiritual shoulders to the plow and get after it. I think that's what Francis Bacon would want as well. And well, that's it for me. Are you ready to elevate your leadership journey through exploring the wisdom of the ages? Subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all major podcast platforms, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube Music. You can also find us everywhere else podcasts are available. If you find value in our episodes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, and of course, YouTube. We need those reviews to grow, and it is truly the easiest way to help other leaders and lovers of literature discover this show. And thank you for your support.